Drift transition techniques. So what is a drift transition? So a transition in drifting is when a driver changes the direction of his drift. So basically, for example, here this is in Irwindale for Formula Drift. This is our start. So we'd launch the car. We would initiate the drift. We'd go to outer zone 1 out here. Then we would transition. We would change the direction of our drift. Basically, we would go from drifting towards the left to drifting towards the right. So we transition here. That's what it is. Then we'd be drifting to the right, hit inner clip 1, transition again, outer zone 2, then hit inner clip 2 over here, power out to outer zone 3, and finish. So basically, transitioning is just changing, pretty much just changing the direction where we're drifting, pretty much. And then the first technique we're going to discuss is lifting off throttle. So this is as the driver is about to transition, he would lift off the throttle, so he'd release the throttle pedal for the rear tires to catch some grip, which straightens the car a bit. And as the driver is steering in the direction he wants to transition to, he would apply throttle and catch the drift. So basically, imagine we are drifting towards the right, so our steering wheel would be turned to the left. So we're drifting a right corner. Our steering wheel is to the left of the center, and we want to transition, so we want to start drifting instead of to the right, we want to drift to the left. So what we would do is, in this technique, we would lift off the throttle for the rear tires to catch some grip, and as they catch some grip, we're going to start counter steering for the other direction that we're going to transition to in our drift. And basically, that's how you use this technique. It's a very simple technique, and as you would catch the drift for the other side, in our case this left corner, you would modulate the throttle and you would catch the steering angle for the drift towards the left side. It's a well-known technique, it's a simple technique, good for beginners, and it's good for dry conditions too. And then we go to clutch kicking. This is when a driver clutch kicks, when he pushes in the clutch, applies some throttle, and releases the clutch pedal, while steering in the direction he wants to transition to, and transitioning and catching the drift by modulating the throttle and steering. So basically, let's say we've got the same scenario as last time, so we're drifting a right corner, so we're drifting towards the right, our steering wheel is towards the left of center, and we want to transition and start drifting towards the left instead of the right. So in this technique, what we would do is, as we're about to transition, we would lift off throttle a bit, but at the same time we would push in the clutch, we would start to counter steer a bit as we are gripping up the rear tires slightly when we're off throttle. We push in the clutch, push in the throttle, release the clutch rapidly, and it will kind of give us a boost, a kick at the rear. Although you can end up having too much wheel spin at the rear, and therefore you'd prolong your drift a lot. You've got to start counter steering, then once you start clutch kicking, and then you've got to catch the steering angle after you transitioned and modulate with the throttle. So this is a bit more of an advanced technique. It's good for both dry and wet conditions. It creates a lot of additional rear wheel spin because obviously when you clutch kick you are just slipping the rear tires a lot, and you've got a lot of additional rear wheel spin, so you can prolong your drift like that. It is more prolonged, the transition, especially in wet conditions with lots of throttle input, you can imagine, because if you clutch kick in the wet, you just stay spinning forever, or even worse in ice conditions. And usually, if a driver gets this right, he can get a snappy transition if clutch kicking mid-transition. So if, for example, he lifts off the throttle and he is starting to straighten, but as he's starting to straighten, he pushes in the clutch, throttle, and he releases the clutch, so he clutch kick fully, more or less mid-transition. So when he's really close to straightening, he would clutch kick, and as you can imagine, it would kind of kick the car a bit from the rear, and it would be a nice snappy transition. Then there is over counter steering. So this is when a driver applies a more than required amount of counter steer to start the transition. So what I mean by this is that the driver would apply more steering towards the direction he wants to transition, thereby forcing the car to transition due to the excessive amount of counter steer applied. So basically what I mean is, for example, the same scenario where drifting towards the right, our steering wheel is to the left, we want to transition towards the left. So as we are counter steering for this right drift, we would apply a bit more excessive counter steer over here. So we'd add a bit more angle counter steering on the wheel. So in our case, we'd add more left steering, and we would force the car to turn and transition into the left drift in our case. And then we'll have to quickly, of course, our reaction times will have to be very good, and we will have to counter steer very quickly, and also start modulating the throttle really quickly. It's a much harder technique. It's much more advanced. It's very easy to get wrong. It requires a lot of feel for the grip, because as you can imagine, if you start to apply too much angle here, what can happen is that you can't straighten, and then you can start understeering because you applied way too much angle at the front and you start to lose grip at the front tires. If way too much counter steer is applied, the driver can easily straighten and start understeering instead due to the loss of grip at the front, usually best in dry conditions and good when mixed with other techniques. So, for example, clutch kicking or lifting off throttle. When you start to add the excessive amount of steering, so you can grip up the rear a bit and you can get a bit of a boost as you start to transition. And then we have the handbrake transition. So this is when a driver applies, usually a small amount of handbrake right before transitioning to grip up the rear tires a bit from the additional rear wheel spin. The car starts to straighten a bit and the driver applies throttle at the right time to catch the drift after the transition, creating a nice snappy transition. So, for example, the same scenario, we're drifting towards the right and our steering wheel is to the left. What we're going to do is, as we're about to transition, we're going to push on the clutch, pull the handbrake a bit, not too much. We don't want to lock the rear tires, because actually what can happen like that is we would prolong our drift towards the right, because our rear has much less grip, so to transition like that will be much harder, pretty much. We just want to apply just a bit of handbrake. The reason being, we just want to slow down the rear rotation at the wheels to grip up a bit, because as you can imagine, if we have an excessive amount of rear wheel spin, for example, if we clutch kicked before and we have a real excessive amount of wheel spin at the rear, then pulling the handbrake slightly will slow down the rear wheel spin a bit, will gain a bit of grip, and to transition like that, we can make our transition more snappy like that. If you pull it off right, it can be very nice. So again, the same scenario. So what we're going to do is we're going to push on the clutch, we're going to pull the handbrake just a bit, release the clutch, and then we are going to use maybe some other techniques like lifting off the throttle, for example. We're going to start counter steering, we're going to of course catch the steering wheel, and we're going to get back on throttle, modulating the throttle. We can also, for example, use this technique right after we transition. So for example, in icy conditions we transitioned and we clutch kicked. As you can imagine, there's a lot of excessive rear wheel spin, so what we'll do is we will push on the clutch right after we transition and pull the handbrake just a bit, the same technique pretty much. Then once we're done from using the handbrake, we would release the clutch. That's the transition. It is a much more advanced technique, of course. It requires a lot of feel and precision with the amount of handbrake input and timing. If the driver pulls it off well, the transition can be very snappy and quick, very beneficial in low grip conditions where it is crucial for the driver to find as much grip as possible. For example, in icy conditions, it's really, really vital for you to find as much grip as you can while drifting, especially when competing. Applying slight handbrake after transition is also beneficial if, for example, clutch kicking mid-transition to grip up. For example, like I mentioned before, in the icy conditions, it can be very beneficial then. Then we have other techniques and mixing. So, of course, these weren't all the techniques, but these were some of the more well-known techniques mentioned. And there are an infinite amount of combinations and mixes of all of these techniques. When watching on boards and different drivers, for example, you'll notice they all have their own style, their own techniques, and it's really fun watching, obviously. Thanks for watching and please subscribe.